Hello, my friends. This is Story of the World, page by page, The Great War. Let's get started. So for the last few weeks, we've been studying the 19th century, and that was an era of steam engines, massive empires, and the scramble for Africa. This was a time of progress with a capital P, but today we're going to see what happens when all that industrial power and imperial ego collide. By 1914, Europe wasn't just a continent, it was a powder keg waiting for a spark. I mean, why did the whole world go to war over one assassination? Well, remember the acronym MAIN. M is for militarism. Countries were flexing their new industrial muscles and they were building massive navies. There were A for alliances. It was like a giant, dangerous web of I've got your back promises. I would be for imperialism. Everyone wanted the same land and the same resources. And finally, N is for nationalism. That is an intense, my country is better than yours attitude. When Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated in June 1914, the alliance web snapped shut, and within weeks, cousins King George, Kaiser Wilhelm II, and Tsar Nicholas II were leading their nations into a fight that would destroy the world that they knew. I mean, everyone thought they'd be home by Christmas, but they weren't. Because of machine guns and heavy artillery, soldiers couldn't just charge across the field anymore. They dug in, they created a stalemate, and thousands of miles of zigzagging trenches with no man's land in the middle. This was the first industrial war. We saw tanks, which were literally armored boxes on tracks, chemical gas that required terrifying masks, and the first airplanes used for scouting. It was high tech for 1914, but it meant that millions of people were stuck in the mud for years. Now let's take a look at the men who actually signed the orders. You might think these leaders were strangers, but 3 of them were actually grandsons of the same woman, Queen Victoria. Remember how I mentioned that she was the grandmother of Europe? Well, imagine a family Thanksgiving where everyone has a 1,000,000-man army. That was Europe in 1914. Kaiser Wilhelm of Germany felt like the black sheep of his family. And as you remember, he really wanted to prove that Germany was the top dog. And meanwhile, his cousins, George in England and Nicholas in Russia, were trying to keep their old empires from falling apart. On the other side of the Atlantic, you have our President Woodrow Wilson. He didn't care about royal family drama. He wanted to be the referee of the world. And eventually brought the U.S. in, not to win land, but in his mind, he wanted to make the world safe for democracy. 1917 was the year that everything flipped. First, we have Russia collapsing. A revolution at home overthrew Tsar Nicholas II, and the new government quit the war. But just as Germany thought they had won, the United States joined the fight. Angry about submarine attacks and the Zimmermann telegram, remember that was a secret German plot to get Mexico to attack the United States. President Woodrow Wilson sent millions of fresh troops and supplies, and this American wave broke the German army's spirit. In 1914, the world changed so much. When millions of men marched off to the front, the world didn't just stop spinning. Actually, it kind of needed to speed up. I mean, if the factories stayed quiet, the soldiers had no bullets. And if the farms stayed empty, the country literally starved. This was total war, and women were the ones that kept the lights on. First, we have the Canary Girls. Imagine going to work and coming home with bright yellow skin and hair that turned ginger orange. This was the reality for the munitionettes. They handled TNT to make shells and explosives. It was dangerous, toxic work that literally changed their appearance, earning them the nickname Canary Girls. But they didn't quit. They knew that for every shell they made, a soldier had a chance to come home. Then there were the land girls. Before the war, people thought farming was man's work, but with the men gone, women took over the plows and the livestock. They weren't just gardening, they were fighting a war against hunger. Without them, the naval blockades would have turned cities into ghost towns. They provided that they were just as tough and just as essential as any soldier. Here's the real shift. For the first time, people saw women driving buses, delivering the mail, and welding steel. Society had spent centuries saying women weren't strong enough or weren't smart enough for these jobs. But by 1918, that argument was pretty much dead. And if you think the home front was the only place women were making a difference, think again. Thousands of women decided that staying home wasn't enough, so they packed their bags and they headed straight toward the sound of cannons. They didn't just want to support the war, they wanted to be in it. First, let's talk about the nurses and ambulance drivers. These weren't just people handing out bandages in quiet hospitals. They were driving heavy, vibrating trucks through deep mud and falling shells to pick up wounded soldiers. They worked in casualty clearing stations just miles from the fighting, often in the dark, performing surgery by candlelight while the ground shook from explosions. They were the last line of hope for millions of men. In a world before cell phones or the internet, how did a general tell his troops to move? They used telephones, but the army had a really big problem. The wires were a mess, and they needed people who could speak both English and French perfectly and work fast under pressure. Well, enter the Hello Girls. These were expert switchboard operators. They wore army uniforms, took military oaths, and worked right behind the front lines connecting vital combat calls. But here's the kicker. When they got home, the government said, well, thanks, but you aren't actually veterans. It took over 60 years, until 1977, for the United States to finally give them the medals and recognition they earned in 1918. On November 11th, 1918, at exactly 11 in the morning, the Great War ended. We call this the armistice. An armistice isn't a final peace treaty, it's more like a giant timeout where everyone agrees to lay their weapons down. Historians tell us that in the last seconds before 11 a.m., the cannons were firing faster than ever as both sides tried to get their last shots in. Then there was silence. Men who had been trying to kill each other for over 4 years suddenly climbed out of their holes and looked across no man's land. Some shook hands. Some just sat down and cried. The world was finally quiet. So why does this matter today? We celebrate Veterans Day or Remembrance Day on November 11th. We don't just do it to remember a date on a map. We do it to remember that the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month was the moment the world decided that enough was enough. In many countries, people still stand in silence for 2 minutes at 11 a.m. on this day. It's a way to honor the millions of soldiers, the canary girls in the factories, the hello girls on the switchboards, and the families who waited for 4 long years for the noise to stop. For over 50 years before the war, women had been marching, protesting, and even going to jail for one simple right, the right to vote. They were told no over and over again. Politicians said women didn't understand war, didn't understand the economy, and weren't tough enough for politics. Well, then 1914 happened. As the war dragged on, the argument against women voting began to crumble. How could a government say a woman wasn't tough enough for politics when she was spending 12 hours a day building heavy artillery shells in a dangerous factory? How could they say she didn't understand the economy when she was the one running the shops, running the banks, running the farms? The suffragettes leaders like Alice Paul in the United States shifted their strategy. They focused on the factories and the hospitals and said, hey, if we are good enough to help save this country, we are good enough to help lead it. Even President Woodrow Wilson, who hadn't supported the vote before, changed his mind. He called women's suffrage a vitally necessary war measure. He realized that the country couldn't ask women to sacrifice everything for a democracy that didn't let them participate. By the end of the war, the old way of thinking was gone. In 1918, the UK passed a law letting many women vote for the first time. 2 years later, in 1920, the United States passed the 19th Amendment. It wasn't a gift to women. It was a right they had finally forced the world to recognize through their bravery during the war. So what's the verdict? The 19th century world of kings and empires died in the mud of World War I. New countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia were born, and the map of the Middle East was redrawn. We often call this war the war to end all wars, but as we'll see in our next chapter, the way this war ended actually laid the tracks for the next one. The quest for peace, the fight for equality, and the struggle against dictators, these are the 20th century themes we are still dealing with today. All right, my friends, that's all I have today. Thanks so much. See you next time.